Hey folks, Steve here with a very special review video for you today. We're going to be talking about Axis Empires Ultimate Edition, the release from Decision Games, designed by Thomas Prowl. And, well, it's been the game that's occupied my time for the last, I think, couple of months. And I'm ready to do the review. This has taken some time to put my thoughts together. I can certainly say that I have played the crap out of my copy of the game. This review is going to be based on my solitaire play of a number of the training scenarios, various smaller scenarios across Totaler Krieg and Dicenso, which are part of the game package, as well as my Dice of Decision campaign, which included usage of Schiffskrieg. So I've gotten a chance to use every module in the package, and I think I can talk about how I feel about the game, and at least inform a few others about it. So, in case you didn't know, Axis Empires has a lineage going back to a game called Krieg. That became Totaler Krieg, that became second edition of Totaler Krieg, and various things to ultimately becoming Axis Empires Totaler Krieg with the Pacific Theater game Dicenso, which is a more recent entry into the family here, but Axis Empires Ultimate Edition is one big package that encompasses the whole ecosystem. Because of that, I'll just say right out of the gate, the product itself, if you go to purchase it from Decision Games, is going to be pricier, so know that. It is a grand strategy, or at least big operational strategic, World War II game. Those tend to be expensive. The game sits in the same class more or less as A World at War, a game called The War, World in Flames, but we'll talk about that in a bit. So it's a lot of game, certainly. It's a lot of game, and it's going to cost some dollars. You should know that going in. The size of the box is at least one indication of the weight of what you're getting. And it is a pretty heavy box. It's filled with a lot of cool stuff. So knowing that it's a big World War II strategic game, there's going to be comparisons made in this video to other games of its kind. I'm going to try to do my best to keep the commentary to Axis Empires itself. At the very tail end of the video, I will spend some time making some comparisons to games in the same sort of genre, because I think if you just want to listen to this video and know, is Axis Empires any good? Should I pick up this product? I can talk to you about that without making a huge amount of comparisons to World in Flames or World at War or something else. But I know there are folks who are specifically asking for that, and so I'm going to put that at the tail end of the video. After we cover most other things, I should be able to talk to that very specifically separately, based on who wants to hear it. I think that's going to be the important thing. So, anyway, let's talk about the game itself. I want to talk about the components right out of the gate, because I think that's an easy thing to get out of the way very quickly. The components are really, really good. So this is from Decision Games. I think of my Decision Games, the components, and then when I say that, I also mean like the rule book and the way things are laid out, the overall aesthetic experience of the player trying to learn how to play the game, or at least interface with the components, are all really, really good. Really good for Decision especially. I think this is their like crowning achievement of a game in their catalog, in terms of just what are you getting and how is it all coming together. The counters are very nice, and I still have my game sort of set up here. We're talking brown core, thick counters. I chose not to round the corners because they were nice enough. I didn't feel that I had to, plus it was a lot of counters. But the counters are very nice, and I really appreciate the color choice in every force pull. The colors look good, they're easy to read, they're distinctive. I just like the color palette, which sounds like a silly thing to say, but until you've played games where the color palette of the counters is either not to your taste, or whatever, like having a game where the colors are nice, they're all readable, they look pleasant on the map, that is a nice aesthetic thing that I appreciate. The maps are paper maps. Now, for me, that's not a big deal. I put plexiglass on my war game maps. I've invested in plexiglass, and it served me well over the years. But they are paper. So I know that it's very in vogue to want to have mounted maps on harder cardboard, or I guess whatever the material is on mounted maps these days. To me, that is not a big deal. If they had made these mounted maps, the cost would have increased even more. And I'm not sure it actually does that much good, in the grand scheme of things. So if you really want a mounted map, maybe you can get some made yourself. They are paper maps. They are nice paper maps. They laid out pretty easily, but definitely, the plexiglass helped to flatten them out even more. So what you may want to do with the paper maps is, maybe get some plexi, set it down, and let it flatten out, and then take the plexi off if you don't really want the plexiglass there. I will say in the Dice of Decision module, which I think is super cool, by the way, they have these overlay maps. They're also kind of thinner paper. They're very delicate, and some of these map overlays are not much, in some cases, not much bigger than a quarter. Like they're only so big. You could very easily damage or crumple those if you're not careful. So please be careful if you're going to get the game and you have those. They come in a nice little baggie with some backing, so you can kind of keep them safe and snug. If you're going to play with Dice of Decision and those overlays, they're going to get jostled around underneath your plexiglass if you bump your table, if you bump your plexiglass, and they get knocked around a little bit. So you may want to think about not playing with plexiglass if you're going to use the Dice of Decision overlays, especially during the Dice of Decision process, because you're going to be moving things around. You're going to be changing out overlays potentially throughout that process, and that can be a little bit of a functional challenge to deal with. Now, besides that, we also have player aid cards, and let me tell you, the player aid cards are really quite nice. Here's an example of one. This is the Daisenso Axis faction, and they have sequence of play, they have attack sequence guidance, combat results table on the back, a number of charts that matter for the game, political things, diplomatic things, and on the inside, which you don't really need to use at all most of the time, but on the inside of the player aid cards, you have all the charts and guidance for Schiffskrieg. So if you're not playing with Schiffskrieg, you're really just doing this. And if you are playing with Schiffskrieg, you'll occasionally open it up. But you have really most of what you need. Whoa. Oh, jeez, guys. I'm not editing that out. We're doing that live. The player aid chart gets you pretty much everything that you're going to need most of the time when you're playing. That's until you have to look up a political event, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So the player aid cards are nice. They're good. They're cardstock material, and they are very functional, which is good. They are very helpful. I reference them a lot. They made it easy to navigate. Now, there are some things that I might look at and just, it helps to look at the rulebook anyway, but that problem didn't happen too much. The cards are very nice. Now, these are just, basic board game cards. They're nothing super special. But because you're really using these as reference cards more than anything, it's not as though you have a hand of cards. So for you watching that have not played Axis Empires or familiar with this, the game includes cards. It's not a card-driven game. You use the cards to decide kind of your production and your political approach for the next season of play. So you're playing 4 of these a year, a game year, and they usually have some mixture of giving you replacements, adding to your force pool, different political events and different things, really important game triggers. But most of the time, these cards are just sitting, on the side of the map to direct play. You're not necessarily sifting through them a whole lot unless you're picking a card to play. But the cards are all very nice. The card art on the back sides are evocative and pleasant to kind of accompany the game. And the cards all work really good for that. And just in general, again, the presentation of all these components, especially when they're out on the map, is all very, very good. The map art is changed a little bit from the last edition. I prefer the newer art. I think the colors are just a little bit better. It all looks really nice set out and being played. So aesthetically, the game is very good. In terms of the rule book, this is in a sort of, I guess we would refer to it as sort of standard decision game style. It's a 3-column format, not a 2-column format. You might think that might be harder to read, but it works pretty well for how they're conveying the information. I would generally say the rule books are pretty good. Now, you get multiple rule books in the box. You get a core rule book. You get a Totaler specific book, a Daisenso specific book. You get a Schiffskrieg book, and the Dice of Decision book. Now, most of the time, these books are being used as references. So, for Totaler, meaning you're playing a scenario on the European map of the Totaler sort of part of the package, the Totaler rulebook is really used to look up political events and to direct you to do different things. It also includes the scenario information. So it's not as though you're having to learn extra things. It's really just in the course of play, you'll be asked to look up something in the book and it'll tell you what's supposed to happen. So you may be a political event occurs. It tells you what number to look at. You look at the number and it tells you that's the game effect. It also includes references for game markers that are in that part of the game. So you can see, oh, okay, it's this marker that gets placed. What does that marker do? Very easy to reference and look up what that marker does. It's actually pretty good. It's a pretty good system. This, in fact, is better than I thought it might have been. The core rulebook itself is pretty clear, and it is nice, though maybe if you're colorblind, this could prove an issue, where they do color code some paragraphs in the rules to make sure you know that this is a rule that is specific to Totaler or a rule that is specific to Daisenso, which is the Pacific Theater part of the package. Now, you could just read the text and kind of know that it applies, but very quickly at a glance, you can go, let's say if you're just playing a Totaler scenario, you see a big block of red text, you can skip over that. Doesn't matter for what you're playing, or vice versa, or if you're playing a combined game, well, you got to read everything anyway. But the rules are laid out pretty well. They're pretty clear. I had a few questions along the way, but nothing super serious. I think they did a good job organizing the rules. It is very clear the way they have it set up. They largely have the rules organized by sequence of play, but they do have sort of the rules that apply all the time in a very specific section of the book, and you can read that and kind of get very familiar with how it gets played. And then to the great strength of Axis Empires, the training scenarios that are in the Totaler book, also technically the Daisenso book, that teach you how to play are really effective. Now, there are aspects of the combat model that I had to get my head wrapped around at first, but I found that was mostly just because of the Case White training scenario, kind of having the, like, here's the border with Russia, and that weirdly affects the way that you think about retreats. But in a campaign game, that is less of an issue, or it doesn't happen quite the same way all the time. So whatever strangeness I might have experienced early on really tended not to matter later as I got to playing the game in earnest in a different geographic situation was playing out operationally on the map. So the training scenarios are really good, and they help you get up on top of the system if you're used to another system like I was, and you're just trying to figure out, hey, how do I play this? How does it even work? The training scenarios will help you do that. And I found that to be a great strength. In fact, I'd even say it's got the best on-ramp in class for this sort of World War II game. I mean, there are few others that can do this. It gives you the setup, you set up, okay, and it talks you through the rules that are going to be applied, and it kind of makes mention of, hey, you might want to look at this and be familiar with that. And you build up that. So while you could read the rule book from cover to cover and try to absorb it, hitting those training scenarios really helped me ramp up, and that was really good. Now, the Schiffskrieg rulebook is something you have to add on. So if you're going to play with Schiffskrieg, you have to read more rules. There's more scenario information in that book. There's just more to consume, and you may find yourself, yes, having to look at the core rulebook, look at the Schiffskrieg rulebook, and kind of bounce between them if you're playing with that. But knowing that that is an optional sort of expansion thing, you can take that, your mileage may vary there in terms of what kind of scenario you're playing. That's a big factor. So in terms of just, again, the components, the way that things are laid out, how you interface with the game, really stellar job. I think this was a fantastic accomplishment. This is a game that has gone through multiple iterations, so it's not as though this version just sort of burst out of the ether, but it has been refined into a really good game experience package that I really appreciate. So that has been really great. It's a nice looking game to have up on the table, and they did a great job with that. So that out of the way, excellent stuff. So the next thing I want to talk about very quickly is just the game operations now. I have played, you can look at the videos on my channel, I've played a lot of different scenarios. I've gotten to play out the system. I don't think I could do a tutorial in this video like I do in some of my reviews. It's just too much to try to cover. But if you're curious about the game system, we are talking hex and counter. We are dealing with largely a focus on ground combat. And so this is getting factors together, getting ratios, and then the modifiers to your die rolls are really, or the game combat situation, is really around shifts. You're either shifting left or right on the combat table. So if you're at 3-to-1 odds, but you get a shift to the right, you're now on the 4 or 5-to-1 column, and those are going to be better results. Those shifts come from things like terrain, whether an HQ is included, if you have air support, and we'll talk about that in a moment, things like that. So you can kind of figure out, especially with the stability in terms of strength numbers, you don't have wildly different strength numbers within a given faction's force pool. Sometimes you do, but a lot of the time you can say, hey, this is a full strength German army. It's going to have a combat power of 5 or 6, and it's attacking a defending combat unit with a strength of 1 or 2, and you can kind of figure out what, the rough equation of how many of your units are going to be needed to make significant gains against an opponent. But you do have those additional unit differentiators, armor, and that interplays with the blitz mechanic. So in terms of just a general operational format, the mechanics are straightforward, right? If you've played a hex and counter game before, there should be nothing immediately confusing about the way that the game is played. The key thing is the support markers. Now, this is a big difference whether you're playing Schiffskrieg or not, but if you're not, the base game is you have support units. These are air units, these are fleet units or CV fleet units, or bombers that represent these additional things that are on top of the ground war. And again, I do think the game intentionally says, hey, this is really a ground war game. These other aspects are there, but they're there in a more subdued way if you're not playing with Schiffskrieg. Basically, it is a resource game. So you as a player will say, hey, I would like to use my air unit. That air unit will provide a number of benefits operationally on the game map, providing a shift in combat to your units nearby, potentially not allowing enemy units to retreat into a hex, so you can kind of shape their retreat path with air units. But when you go to place them, your opponent, if they have air units and have appropriate basing to allow them to play it, which is straightforward, they can contest it and basically nullify your placement. So if you actually want to place your marker and get the benefits, your opponent either has to decline to contest it, which, there may be good reasons to do that, maybe not, or you have to out-marker them, meaning ideally you have 3 air units, your opponent only has 2, in which case you can always place it. Then your opponent has to decide, do I deprive my enemy of 2 markers knowing he's still going to get through, or do I hold some of mine in reserve for later? And that's a weird little calculus that I don't think I've cracked the code on, but it comes down to the die roll modifiers to something called delay, which really just means once you use those markers, they go to a box, and at the end of the turn, you roll to see when you get those markers back. They may show up in one turn, it might be a couple turns, and there are die roll modifiers that are influenced by the strategic situation. So early on, Germany may have pretty good delay die roll modifiers, meaning if they use an air unit, they can expect to get it back within a couple of turns. But later in the game, and we're dealing with Allied bombing, we're dealing with U.S. support, various number of things, will actually make it harder, and it could be that the Germans won't get a particular marker back for 4 to 7 turns or more, or something like that. And if your faction is getting markers back faster than the opposite faction on average, you can spend your markers much more willingly, and you start to attrition them out that way. So there's a nice little algorithm there you could look at, and it does match with the strategic situation. If you're playing a historical campaign or one that starts in 1939 or 1937, the Axis will always eventually lose out because of that. So that is sort of baked into the system in the way that the delay die roll modifiers work. Eventually, no matter how good the Germans are doing, they will kind of start to get forced back, and their ability to get those sort of force multipliers or those big helping support units will start to go away. Now, that goes also, we talked about air units. There are naval units that do basically the same thing. You can use a fleet unit to shut down ports in a particular naval area. The game does more or less rely on a naval area, sea area, than just pure hexes for that purpose. And you also need to place fleet units if you want, or air units, I guess, if you want to do an amphibious invasion. And the mechanics for that, I think, do a pretty good job of saying, hey, you've got to put a lot of effort into trying to do an amphibious invasion, and it's a pretty major effort to do one of those, so you're going to be using lots of markers. Your enemy's going to be trying to contest them because it usually opens up a tough new front in the fight. It all works together pretty well from that perspective. So I think if you do a good job with the training scenarios, and you learn how to play the game, and you execute, I think the system really works well. It's not terribly complicated, which is a good thing, I will say, and you can get right to playing. It's a very playable game, I'll say. So setup tends to be very easy, and then actually playing tends to be pretty easy once you get the hang of things. So you can play pretty fast, pretty rapidly, which is a strength. Now, Schiffskrieg kind of does something a bit different there, and I got to be careful because I know this is a sensitive topic for people. So with Schiffskrieg, those support markers that you have, I guess in the base game, all these different naval, air combats, different things, all happen underneath the hood of those support markers. And if you've ever heard the term of the closed watch case, in terms of like, hey, there's stuff going on, but it's underneath your level of abstraction. You don't see it. You can't deal with it. Well, Schiffskrieg kind of opens that up. Now, you still use support markers when you're playing a Schiffskrieg. So this is where and we're going to start to get into some contentious territory in this review. But hear me out. When you're playing that, if you don't play with Schiffskrieg, one negative is you can play your markers against each other, and you don't really know who won that fight or what's the real net effect of it until the end of the turn when you do the die rolls for delay segment. Not terribly climactic, doesn't feel great at the table. Not as good as it could be. Now, Schiffskrieg changes that. What happens is, when you play a support marker, you create a task force that is the units that represent that support marker. So if we're talking about a fleet marker, you're going to roll a die, and that's going to determine how many ships you can put in your task force and send them out. When your opponent does the same thing to contest it, they have a die roll, and there you can have some interesting results, like maybe I roll a 1, and that means I can only send 7 ships in my task force. My opponent rolls a 6, and now they can send 12. And well, 12 versus 7 ships is certainly an advantage to the 12-ship fleet. You then take those units, and each of those has a distinct counter for, there's an abstraction level to keep in mind there, which, I'm not going to go too deep into the details here, but you pick up those units, you take them to the naval battle board, and you roll off. Now, the combat system, in my understanding, is based off like Victory in the Pacific, which I'm not overly familiar with. But basically, each ship is going to be rolling dice for its strength and gunnery factors or airstrike factors. You want to be rolling 5s or 6s, and in some cases, you really just want 6s to determine if you hit, and then you'll do some additional rolling to see how bad the hit was. So it's kind of a bucket of dice system, essentially. But you do line up, these gunnery factors against this enemy ship, or these air points against this enemy ship, or what have you. Or if it's air to air, it's just, the planes shooting at each other. The system works fine. I think, it reminds me a bit of even Fire in the Sky, where, you just kind of want sixes on D6s. And what will tend to happen is the more ships you have, obviously the better off you'll be in an individual combat, but those ships are then used. So you kind of have to be careful, how many ships you send with the task force, especially if you think you're going to need to use another marker, because for every marker you pull, you have to create a new task force. Now, what's really nice about Schiffskrieg is it provides the capability for someone to say, hey, scratch one flat top, which is great. It is fun to kind of see the naval battle and see the result. Sometimes those results can be very bloody, sometimes not. And so it just depends on how hot your dice are in any given moment. I've had naval battles where 3 aircraft carriers were sunk. I've had other combats where, like, nothing was sunk. Everybody missed every single die roll, and everybody went home. It was, sometimes that can happen, I guess. But the thing that I found interesting was that because at the end of all the combats, you look to see at the results, and 90% of the time, to me anyway, it felt this way, 90% of the time, you get the same game effect as if you weren't playing with Schiffskrieg and you were just playing the support markers. The support markers nullify each other most of the time. They go to the delay box, per usual. And then it is that lower level of like, well, what's going on with my individual ships? What can happen is you start to run out of things to make up your task forces. And on rare occasions, you might find that you or your opponent can't use a support marker because you don't have units of that type nearby to actually make it, to form it and have a represented task force to fight with that support unit, so you can't play it. Now, that happened rarely, but it did happen. I think Schiffskrieg is at its most impactful when you're playing it from the get-go in a 1937 or 1939 type of scenario where you're playing from the beginning of the war, and the Axis maybe has the opportunity to win some critical naval or air engagements early on that can have a larger strategic impact, and that sort of happened in my Dice Decision campaign. The first time I tried Schiffskrieg was in a 1944 Pacific campaign, in which case most of the strategic elements had already been decided, so it was really, beaten up on the Japanese fleet a lot of the time. And so I think if you're going to play with Schiffskrieg, you should do it when you're playing a grand campaign, a big campaign starting from 1937. I think that's the best time to do it. I do think as I played it more, particularly in my Dice Decision campaign, it did prove itself to have interesting impacts on the gameplay. In particular, in my Dice of Decision game, which is the part of the game where you can head off into very strange alt history circumstances, the Germans had 2 aircraft carriers, and that changed the complexion of the battle for the North Sea and the overall Battle of the Atlantic, because rather than being at the mercy of British aircraft carriers, we could go toe-to-toe, and so long as we could do that, we kept the rest of our German ships safe. And even just having that little bit of air cover gave the staying power to the fleet that we could continue to expect to use our German fleet markers and be able to keep using them without totally losing our ships to attack. So it sort of incentivized us to use the German fleet because we had aircraft carriers. If we were playing without Schiffskrieg, there would have been no difference, and I would have just felt, I would be just as capable as usual, but because those aircraft carriers were there and we were playing with Schiffskrieg, it added a different dynamic. So I think my initial thought on Schiffskrieg was it didn't provide enough value for the time, right? There are certainly more complex games that have a more complex air-naval model, and you just accept that as part of the game. Like, that's the default assumption. For Axis Empires, Schiffskrieg is this add-on. It's something new. It's something different. And to be worthwhile, to be part of the game package, it has to justify itself. My initial thought when I had played was, I'm not sure it justifies itself very well. It is better to be able to say, scratch one flat top. It is better to be able to know how the fight went at the time it was fought. There's a huge psychological benefit to that. But I had worried that it didn't change enough of the game because you're really just worried about support markers. At the end of the day, that is what is important. But I saw enough in my Dice of Decision game where things could be different. Things did matter a bit differently than they had before. And it does matter where you base things and where you're going to lean your strength. So this is a bit contentious, even in Board Game Geek discussion. I generally think, now that I'm used to it, I mean, if I were playing solitaire in a 1937 campaign, I'd probably use Schiffskrieg, but as the game wore on and we got to like 1943 and things were going the direction they were going, I'd probably stop playing with it and just revert to core game. In an opposed game, I suspect many folks will want to play with Schiffskrieg, and I'm perfectly okay with that. So I'm glad it's in the package. I think Schiffskrieg provides options to players who've been seeking this. It does add that extra fidelity level. It's not as deep or as granular as other games in the same class, but it adds just enough that it becomes a bit more interesting for the air naval bits, and making it so that there is a little more to the game if you want it, but just know that it is going to add more time. There are extra steps added to the sequence of play. Moving your stacks of units, or even if you're using the fleet markers, you still have to move stuff around, go to the battle board. You're spending more time at the battle board, and then you return to the main board. It's going to add time. So long as you accept the extra time and that the extra nuances that can kind of come with the game, I do think Schiffskrieg's a good add. It's not going to be for everybody, and if you're trying to play a quick World War II sort of strategic game, and you're focused on playability and just doing things fast, you might leave Schiffskrieg out. And I would even say, don't play with Schiffskrieg until you've gotten used to the system, and then you layer on Schiffskrieg after that. So, you know, maybe feels like I'm being a little harsh on Schiffskrieg. The reality is, I think it's a good app. I think it does a lot of cool things. There's some cost to that, but it's not as though I'm not used to playing more, you know, granular, intense, complex games or anything. It's just a matter of making sure you see the value in the system. I did eventually see that. It's a little more circumstantial than maybe it could have been, but it is a significant add to the game. And I think for a lot of folks that maybe have owned previous versions of Axis Empires and are saying, hey, what's the reason to get this? Schiffskrieg certainly adds to that equation. I mean, besides just the great components and the freshening up of the system and everything else going on in the box, Schiffskrieg certainly adds a good bit of functionality to the game, makes it a little more worthwhile to look at and say, let me try the game with this additional functionality. Now, let me talk a little bit more maybe about Dice of Decision, because I've been mentioning that a lot. So Dice of Decision is something that had once existed in a previous version of Totaler Krieg, was not in the Axis Empires version of Totaler Krieg. It got dropped for whatever reason. But they brought it back for the Ultimate Edition, and they've extended the functionality to Dicenso, the Pacific Theater. Dice of Decision is basically a scenario generator where you're rolling dice in, basically you're determining the end of World War I, and you're determining what has happened in the interbellum period between World War I and World War II. And depending on what you roll and how you approach things, I guess, you could wind up with a very different alternate history World War II on your hands. And I did that for my Dice of Decision playthrough. I wanted to see how weird and different could I make it. Now, I did that in, I think, a totally justifiable way to use Dice of Decision, which is to pick the results. So the way it works, you begin rolling dice, and obviously the dice are random, so over time you're going to get a lot of different results, and some results that you get may act as die roll modifiers on the next die roll. So you start to head down these different paths, and depending on what you roll in one chart, it may make it more likely to get other results on the next chart, and so on and so forth. But there's a lot of die rolling involved. There's a lot of world shaping to be done, and it's a very fun, interactive process to do it. I had a ball doing the Dice of Decision setup for my campaign. It was just really fun to play around with the options. So you can obviously roll dice. You can do what I did and just say, I want the result of this die roll to be this, because I think that'd be more interesting. For solitaire, you could do that all day. If you're going to do it with, knowing you're going to play that World War II with a friend or whatever, you might want to make some agreements on approach there, because you could end up with a game that would not be fun to play. The book for Dice of Decision even points this out and makes sure to say, hey, you might want to bid for sides, or you might want to, you're going to want to figure something out. But it is possible that you're going to go through the Dice of Decision process and still wind up with a balanced game, one that is just a little bit different. Maybe you'll get a result that isn't too terribly different, but is just different enough that will make the game a little more interesting than a base game, if you're used to the base game and you just want something a little bit different. I'm so glad that this version of the game includes Dice of Decision. It's one of my favorite parts of the package, to be honest. I think it is totally worth its weight in gold. It's just so much fun to see all the different ways things could go. And I did find that even though I did push for certain types of results, that those results can be very game-changing. There's a concept of ideology that is kind of the base assumption in the core vanilla game, but when you're playing with Dice of Decision, if you have an ideological shift in a faction, well, that can change their capabilities a great deal. Things you would say are the benefits that the US and Britain have in Untitled, well, in a Dice of Decision game, they might not have some of those advantages. Another faction might. Germany might have those advantages. These are things like being able to liberate countries, so that when you take their capital and all their cities, you pull them onto your side. In my game, Germany could do that, and it was a huge game changer. It was really fun to play around with those sorts of things. So Dice of Decision, I think I had said it in a previous video, is a toy in the best sense of the word. It is just fun to play with. It's fun to experiment with. It's a lot of fun just to go through the process. It might feel like tedium to someone else, but for me, it was just like, wow, this is a lot of fun. This is cool. Let's see what happens here. Ooh, all right, now we're in, the Great Depression era. What's happening? Okay, this is going on. Oh, there's a government civil war over here, and now that's going to change the makeup of the game situation. It was just a lot of fun, and I definitely wanted to put that through its paces for the review, and I'm just really glad I did. I think it's a very cool concept. Huge add to the value of the Ultimate Edition product. So while Schiffskrieg, I think you could find reasons not to play with it, and obviously Dice of Decision, like if you want to play World War II as you know it, or closer to it, you just play the games, right? You play the scenarios as is. But it is fun to take a walk on the wild side and do some interesting things with the Dice of Decision module. And the nice thing is, because Axis Empires plays pretty quickly, relatively speaking, to other games in this class, you could play a Dice of Decision game to a point that you're happy with and say, okay, well, that was fun. We can move on to something else. It's a super cool package. And what's nice is it comes with its own player aid cards. There's several. It comes with its own rule book that includes all the extra sort of things and how to make the game get set up correctly. There are cards that are in the decks of cards that are specifically for Dice of Decision things. There are counters for both with and without Schiffskrieg, where you might get different units or more units. There are force pools for Austria-Hungary, so that if Austria-Hungary survives into the World War II period, you have a force pool for Austria-Hungary. It is not just a module in the game, it is a true expansion in the sense that it includes all these components that integrate with the rest of the game, no matter how you're playing it. Those additions to the force pools, for Schiffskrieg, for everything else, for the cards, it is all just part of the package. If you're not playing with Dice of Decision, you don't use those components. They're just not needed. But if you do, it just works the same as everything else. And I think that's really great. And I had a lot of fun with mine. So if there's a hallmark, if there's a great big asterisk on like why Axis Empires Ultimate Edition is worthwhile checking out, I do think Dice of Decision is a big part of that. that capability is huge. We had a great time. I had a great time with my experience with it. Great app. So glad that they supported that. They extended it to Daisenso. Some of the options for Daisenso aren't quite as exciting as what can happen in Europe, in my opinion, but given the geopolitical situation in Asia at the time, I mean, I think you can still end up with some neat, interesting things, twists on the Chinese Civil War and how Japan interfaces with all of that. Overall, very, very happy with that. Now, I want to kind of wrap up this part of the video with some straightforward highlights, I guess, of the system, some pretty big takeaways. One particular thing, and I know this has been said elsewhere, the way that China, because I just mentioned that, is represented in Daisenso is a strength. Now, I don't think, without it being so complex as to be unmanageable, I think it is very difficult to represent China in this period. And a lot of games do it with a very light touch by just saying, hey, it's all the Chinese faction and stuff like the Chinese Civil War is handled kind of off map and you hand wave it. Some games have it where you make a split between nationalist and communist, and that's kind of it, and you don't try to do anything more. For this game, it breaks China up into a number of different sort of provinces, which are treated as their own minor countries that have special rules with how they cooperate with each other and their political, I guess, alignment. And I found it to be a really interesting way to do it. I'll generally agree with the sentiment that it does it best out of games in its class, at least until maybe some other games will come out, who knows. Because I think I mean, if you go look at a map of China in the 30s, in the 40s, you'll understand that it's not just the nationalists. There's these different cliques, there's warlord factions, and they don't conform well to a hex grid. They don't conform well to province borders even, really. So the fact that for Daisenso, there's an approach to say, well, we're going to divide this up by these provinces, these minor countries, these regions, give them a force pull, make them in a certain alignment. It's not as though it's perfect. I don't think any game can be perfect in this situation, but it does it very, very well, and I quite like that a lot. And that drives Japanese strategy. Do you focus in one area to try to break the back of this sub-faction of China and then focus on the next? I found that to kind of be the way to try to crack that nut. And it changes kind of your approach defending and how you can get your Chinese units together, knowing that they're not going to be all super friendly with each other. That really reduces your operational capability to move around and defend, which feels good there. So very interesting. So a huge strength of Daisenso, especially against other games in the same vein. That way to handle China is very interesting, very cool. It takes it to a higher fidelity level, and I appreciated that quite a bit. I think that's very cool. I will say that sort of attached to that, you're going to have minor countries that are on the map, and there's a concept in the game called war status, and I do think that this is going to confuse folks. It kind of confused me. So this is a little bit of a criticism of the game, or maybe a negative point. It's not a major one, but just want to point out that you can have a war status, you can have a posture, you can have a active versus not active status, and those three things kind of together will govern how they operate on the map and whether or not the Axis can attack their units and enter their territory and all this. It's a little odd. Now, once you get it, it's fine, but wrapping your head around it, it's a little more complex than maybe it needed to be. In some games, you just declare war on a country and it's in it, it aligns to somebody, and you just play that through. And there might be a question of, like, does that make Britain go to war? Does that make Russia go to war? The same concepts are here in Axis Empires, but if they're active or not, you can have a country that's active but not at war, which means you've placed their units on the map, but you can't do much with them. But if the Axis goes to war with them, that may or may not bring a major power into war to defend them. That depends on the policy mechanics. And how that really works, very briefly, is just to say, like, each major power and then your minor countries for the map have some kind of policy. If what you want as the allies is to share the same policy name, which is just to say you're aligned together. So they're given names like guarantees, appeasement, isolation. So if you have the same policy name, you operate together. If they're different, then you don't. So the allies want to get into the same alignment of policy, and then if a minor country is invaded, then that triggers the entry of Britain or whomever into the war in earnest. So it makes sense when you really look at it after you get used to it, but it felt a bit confusing. I think new players are going to struggle with that. Which is funny because, like, the operations model of the game is so straightforward and easy, but that political thing will throw folks. Another thing I really liked is the way that the cards, particularly the cards that are used for offensives and combats in, like, the summer, put a timer on things. So typically you'll get a card, it'll provide blitz markers that support your combat. They'll usually provide more units for your force pool, as well as replacement points to put more units on the map. And will usually include some kind of conditional event that allows you to do something special, like align another minor country if you succeed at doing X. Or in the case of Case Yellow, if you hold Paris or 3 other French cities, then you can do the Vichy sort of activity and split France in half, and you do the whole thing. But there's a timer on that. The timer is the card. You play a card for a season, and summer is the special season that has 3 turns to the season. All others have 2 turns to a season. And it kind of sets an objective. I gotta make my objectives, I gotta make my thing happen while this card is active. And if I run out of time, I don't get the special thing, or I'm gonna have to do it differently later. And so that makes things like even Case Yellow and the Battle for France really interesting, because if you can hold on that little bit longer, then Germany is going to have to be forced to completely conquer France, not just take Paris, if you can hold out till the autumn. And the reverse is true for the Allies. So their cards to invade Italy and make Italy collapse early is also on a timer. It also gets connected to the production aspect of the game. So, like, your production is metered by the cards. There is no production phase in this game. It's all on the cards. You make decisions, bundles of decisions based on what you're going to be building and what political choices or maneuvers you're going to make. And you can run into a case where, based on the cards that you're playing, well, if you've thrown your manpower away or your opponent has really overrun you, it's not as though you can just expect to have more steps the next turn. If you've been caught in a bad cadence of card play, you might not get enough step replacements on your next card or your next turn or what have you to stop the bad things from happening. So, you know, as the Axis defending against the Allies, if they can attrit, say, the Americans enough, it's not as though the Americans are getting tons and tons and tons of steps. It doesn't matter that America has a lot of production capability in this game, right? That is represented mostly by strong air and naval resources. There are still plenty of steps, don't get me wrong, but you can try to look at it and say, well, if I can hurt, you know, if the Americans land, but I beat them back and I eliminate a bunch of American steps, it's going to take a while for the Americans to build up their steps again and have a really good invasion attempt. And so you can kind of see the way that the cards, and again, part of that production and political representation, put some real constraints or what feel like historical, realistic constraints on the powers. You have a timer. You got to meet your timer. You got to hit. You got to take that objective. You need to use this card smartly to achieve what you want. And knowing that replacement steps come sometimes feast or famine, you can't afford to throw them away unless maybe you're Russia, because you get tons and tons of steps. But that's realistic, right? We have a huge manpower to pull on as Russia, so it's much easier to get steps out. But on the adverse, they don't have a strong support unit marker pool. So all of those things actually come together really well. The one interesting aspect of things that I wish the game maybe did a bit differently is related to the strategic hexes and really the strategic resource conversation. So the one big thing in terms of how you actually win the game or how victory is adjudicated is with the strategic hexes. So there are a number of hexes that have a outline on the map that are green, gray, or red, signifying kind of who owns those hexes. And your faction will desire to make sure that the enemy doesn't control hexes of your color, and you would like to control hexes of their color, basically. And as you gain control of those hexes in the game, you are going to calculate a strategic value. Obviously, you want to be in the positive in terms of the controlled hexes, and that's going to put you somewhere on the victory point track to get victory points. Now, obviously, the axis start will usually start anyway. Dice of decision may affect this, but we'll start at a deficit, and they'll want to go as high as they can go. At some point in the game, depending on what card they play, they're either going to try to go for it in a way that will enable them to stay positive through the rest of the game or get an automatic victory. The other card that they can play will set it to where they basically plant their flag. At least that's the way I see it. They climb the mountain, they plant their flag, and then the allies must exceed that flag. So if they're at 2 victory points or 3 victory points, they plant their flag at that point. If they lose territory, right, as we know World War II goes, where the Axis reach a high tide and then they're forced back. Once they start getting forced back, the Allies will get victory points. But to actually win the game, they need to have the victory point marker beyond the planted flag. That's the easiest way to explain it. And even if it's a tie, that's considered an Axis victory. So the control of the strategic hexes are really what drive the campaigns that you execute and where you're trying to go. Now, in a base 1937 or 39 historical game, those hexes are in places that, yeah, the Axis are going to want to take. For Germany, it means going into the Low Countries, going into France, going into Norway. If they can do Sea Lion, hey, great, but also then Greece, it gives you a reason to go for Greece. And there's a lot of strategic hexes in Russia. So that alone, you know, they're objective hexes, right? Concept we should all be familiar with, I would think. It's pretty straightforward. What's important is that control of those strategic hexes leading to the victory points are also die roll modifiers in that delay segment. So anything that goes to the delay box, like support markers and certain units, I guess I'll say it this way, if you've built up momentum in terms of your victory points, the quicker you're going to get stuff back. So you certainly have a case where if Axis is experiencing their high tide, they're performing very well, they should have a pretty good delay die roll modifier, which gives them certain advantages to maintain their operations. So they build up momentum. If they can keep that momentum, that will keep them going. That will be offset eventually by the U.S. entry. And what will begin to happen is, even if the Axis is doing very extraordinarily well, and they have good die roll modifiers for their delay segment from victory points, the U.S. commitment level slowly rises after U.S. entry, and that comes with penalties to the Axis delay die roll modifiers, where it begins to offset them and even get them back to parity with the Allies. And then from there, the game is on that balanced knife edge to where the Allies start to take territory back from the Axis. And ultimately, that system works pretty well. I do like that. I think it helps. You know, you're going to have in World War II the rubber band bends this way, the rubber band bends back the other way. And the strategic hexes and the way it works with the delay modifiers fosters that, and it makes sense. The one weird thing is you kind of have to take a different approach with, like, strategic resources. So those hexes are in places where you can justify what they represent beyond just being an important location to grab, right? You could say, well, Paris really is the sort of the economic center, the political center of France, so having that derives benefits from the countryside of France being pulled into the same logistics network to the capital. Germany gets some benefits from that. Having control of Norway helps to control the shipping of mineral resources from Scandinavia to Germany, or control of so on and so on and so on. And it's important to note that like Romania, or well, I guess just for this example, Romania is an Axis strategic hex, so you're expected to just have control of Romania one way or another. But the oil resources that historically would have come from Romania don't have a tangible game effect. The only tangible effect that oil has in the game at all is for Japan in Daisenso, where the US can implement an oil embargo. To get rid of that, you have to have control of oil hexes. And that's it. That's only for Japan. Germany, it matters not at all. You can kind of argue that, okay, Romania is a strategic hex, and maybe we can represent oil resources for that strategic hex. There's also the strategic hexes in Baghdad and Tehran that you can look at and say, well, if you had control of those hexes, that's the implicit control of the oil resources, and obviously the Axis do want control of those hexes, and the die roll modifier benefits you get for that are kind of the oil being used you could look at. So there's a justification there. I do kind of miss that more, I guess, strategic resource constraint. Other games in the same class have that, where oil matters. What kind of units you use might use oil, so you can't, you have to think strategically about where your resources are. That gives you a good reason to go for certain hexes. Here in this game, it's there as strategic hexes, but it's not as though you're actually spending oil or conserving oil or trying to marshal your oil resources or other strategic resources at all. Baku, would be an oil hex in any other game. It's a strategic hex. So it's represented in the game. It's just not granular. I might have appreciated more granularity there, but understanding that in general, Axis Empires is treating everything with a bit of a lighter touch than others, and I think I've made my peace with it. And it might be something that rubs somebody the wrong way if they're used to having oil. If you do Control F, search the PDF, oil doesn't come up very much. That might turn somebody off. I think if you can look at the strategic hexes in terms of what they represent, it's fine. You can roll with it, and you can say, well, the oil is what, I have the strategic hexes that's giving me enough resources that feeds back into my military machine, and that's why my planes are back so soon, because we have the fuel to power those planes or those ships or those mech units that when you reorg units, I didn't talk about reorganization here, but you can break down units into different steps, single step units, or form them up into multi-step units. Much of the time, those multi-step units, when you first get them, can be in the delay box, or when they're removed from the map, they go onto the delay box. Again, you can say that oil or whatever strategic resources are enabling you to re-equip and rearm those formations, those larger formations that will often be related to armor units or stronger army units, munitions, what have you. You can kind of make that abstraction argument, and it works okay. Last thing, and this is a criticism, and I just got to throw it out there. In Schiffskrieg, there is a U.S. naval superiority marker. At some point in the game, if you're playing Daisenso, the U.S. will get this marker. And what it does in Schiffskrieg, and you only use it in Schiffskrieg, is it automatically gives all American ships a +1 to their combat die rolls, which is super powerful. I feel like this is a really kludgy solution to making the game go down a certain path. And when that marker enters the game, it truly is, it feels like Japan shouldn't even bother to fight any naval combats anymore. I mean, if the Americans have a +1, they just start annihilating things, because you get functional 6s damaging or destroying ships Now, at least a third of the time, you're also disabling ships most of the time. And so, or at least half the time, which, believe me, it doesn't take that many die rolls to make something happen like that with the +1. So that +1 marker, yes, it empowers the U.S. It gives them maybe the ability to reach historical thresholds, but it really feels like, oh, you just magically get all these +1. Like you're just, yeah, maybe there's a justification for it. But boy, it just felt like, oh, okay, well, obviously you're going to get this benefit, and the benefit is just so good. It was kind of a weird thing. It just felt a little out of place. You really don't tend to get actual like combat die roll modifiers in Axis Empires, and for there to be one for the naval system that is just blanket for the U.S. across the board felt a little funky. So there's that. So there's good things, there's weird things, and there's a few criticisms I have. But let's get to really a concluding argument for Axis Empires in a vacuum. So ignoring other games in its same class, is Axis Empires Ultimate Edition a good game? Is it a good package? I think I can say without question it is a very good game. Its systems are very good. And while I might have a few criticisms of certain aspects or certain maybe way things play out, or my perceptions of Schiffskrieg, I think when you take all of these things in aggregate, you have Totalkrieg and Dicenso, really good games for their topics, a very playable, and that's an important word here, a very playable World War II strategic game that still feels good, that is fun to play, that you can very easily get to the table. It's very easy to just set up and get going. And because of the way that the force pools work, at least the way that I organized my game markers and counters into baggies based on limited war versus total war, and kind of, with a little bit of organization, you can make it so that setting up any given scenario is really easy and straightforward. I think that's a really strong thing for a game like this. It is fun. When you start to add in Schiffskrieg and Dice of Decision, you really greatly expand the capability of the game. The cards do help folks. Like, there can always be a chance of analysis paralysis in any game, but rather than it being like, well, am I going to build over here? Am I going to do diplomatic things over here? The cards kind of give you a very clear set of choices. And what's interesting is at the beginning of the game, the very beginning of the game of a 1937 campaign, your choices of the pre-war cards are pretty constrained. There's almost like a set order you're probably going to want to play things in. And as it morphs into limited war, which is the next stage of the game, and you get access to more cards, which means more units and more things, your options open up a whole lot. So there's like a straight line of obvious things, then it opens up in a sort of an oval or circle shape maybe of, oh, well, there's a lot of different ways I could play the cards. There's different orders I could play the cards. I start to have these different decisions, mutually exclusive approaches to what I want to do with my cards. And then by the time you reach Total War, your choices constrain a bit, and you're back to a narrow band of, you want to play this card, but you got to play this card before this card before this card. And it's kind of like that in pre-war. So once you're actually at Total War, you are mostly focused on just conducting the war at that point, because the cards you're picking are a bit more constrained. You still have some choices, but they're more straightforward choices. So I think that is really good because it lets people, the cards are this extra element. You can focus on just playing the game. You can even follow the historical card choices. I might recommend that for your first campaign, so you can just kind of see the way things operate together, and then you can go back and say, well, instead of playing that card, I'm going to do this, and see how it's different. But even just having it as a card and saying, okay, if I pick this, I'm going to get these things. And that helps you, especially if somebody who doesn't want to look at a big gigantic map and have way too many choices to make and gets overwhelmed, you can just say, well, I do want to do Barbarossa, so what cards do I need to play to get up to Barbarossa and play that card, and what is that going to give me? Okay. I ended up liking the bundle feature a little bit more than I thought I would. It is nice, it is convenient, and it's hard to make like production mistakes. The other hand is you're going to have to make card choices, and you could make card choice mistakes. So that's why I'm saying, you know, you may want to play the historical schedule the first time so that you know why does it matter that you played this card here. You could screw up your order and then be really screwed. That can happen. So word of caution, look at those cards, be careful of the cards, make sure you understand the flow, but then you'll be okay from there, and it ends up being a pretty straightforward set of choices on what you want to do. So again, wrapping up just in a vacuum as a game in of itself, standing on its own, I think Axis Empires Ultimate Edition is a great package. Is it pricey? It is, but you get a lot of game for it. You get a lot of counters, you get a lot of cards, you get a lot of rulebooks, you get a lot of game. A game that you can play over and over and over again in different permutations, without Schiffskrieg, with Schiffskrieg. Dice of Decision adds numerous ways to play. You can play just Europe, you can play just Pacific, you can play shorter campaigns within that. So there are, you know, I should have counted and told you. There's a whole bunch of scenarios. You can play the smaller ones. You can play like what I did. I played a later half of the war in Europe just because I wanted to play something a bit different and jump right to the part where the Allies are on the attack, and that was a fun game too. So there's a lot of different permutations you can enjoy this game in. I think that's a really strong benefit. I have no qualms recommending this to anybody who has an interest in World War II strategic level games. I think this is a great choice. I think it's a good choice because you get so much, and really the barrier to entry is lower than many of its peers. And that's a no-brainer, right? I mean, if you think you want a World War II game, if you know somebody who's like, hey, I like Axis and Empire, not Axis and Empires, oh my gosh, guys, Axis and Allies, oh my god. Axis and Allies, and they want to play something that's got more fidelity or supply should matter, I think Axis Empires might be a fun game to show them and get them on board with playing deeper war games, because the systems are logical for the most part, and you know there might be a couple weird things with Case White that could throw you for a loop, but everything in the game, like, it is the right level of gameplay where you can jump right in and get to playing. The mechanics are straightforward enough that you can operate well and quickly. And if you want a little bit more detail, you can shift that into Schiffskrieg and get there. So all that to be said, that's a recommendation, guys. I'm really glad I got my copy. I'm really glad that I've been playing it. It's been a lot of fun. Definitely a good game. I have no qualms recommending it to anybody with a passing interest in a World War II strategic game. Now, I need to start talking about the comparison to other games. So here's the thing. If you don't care about its comparison to other games, if you don't mind whether or not it's similar or better or worse than other games of its type, and you just wanted to know, is this worth your time? It is worth your time. I think it's worth anybody's time. And you can exit the video now. Close it out. Leave. Go away. You don't need to watch the rest of this video. It doesn't matter to you. You just go buy Axis Empires and have a good time. But if you want to know my thoughts about this game in comparison to A World at War or World in Flames, then stick around. So this is your last chance to close the video, pause it, go do other stuff, go buy Axis Empires, have a good time. Last chance, and we're going to talk about its comparison to other games. Okay, well, you know me, if you watch my channel long enough, that I am a World in Flames guy. I'm a World in Flames fanboy maybe, I don't know, but I like World in Flames a whole great deal. And I play in a monthly, or, well, cadence is a little fluctuating, but we'll say monthly World in Flames group, and I play it regularly. I've been playing World in Flames for a number of years now. Not a huge number of years, I'm not going to over-exaggerate there, but solidly at least 5 years. Having played it a quite great deal. So that's my main point of reference. I have also owned A World at War for longer than that. I've owned, out of games in this class, I've owned A World at War the longest. And those are kind of going to be my reference point for this conversation. So when people say, you know, World in Flames versus Axis Empires versus A World at War, that's kind of the way I'm going to frame things. Now, there are other games. There are games like The War, which I've not played, which I've heard mixed feelings about. And, well, there's lots of other games. So, here's the deal. I do not think it is appropriate to compare Axis Empires, Ultimate Edition or otherwise, to World in Flames. And I say that because of the way that I play World in Flames. I play World in Flames in what is referred to as the deluxe version, meaning, well, and I'll even be explicit here. My group plays with all the expansions for World in Flames as of the Collector's Edition release from however many years ago that was. We also play with a number of optional rules, like the oil rules, like pilots being a separate build, carrier planes being separate units than just the carriers, limited overseas supply, so we need convoys to get supply through any sea zone we want to trade supply through. We play with a lot of options. That makes the game quite complicated. So you want to talk about complexity. I think Deluxe WiF, the version of WiF that I play, is much more complex than Axis Empires. Now, we choose that. And some of our group maybe would prefer it to not be as intensive as it is. And even myself, at times, can feel overwhelmed with the choices and the detail and the things that I have to keep in mind throughout every turn of a World of Flames game. It's highly intensive. It is exhausting at times. But that's why I play it. I mean, that's why I play it. I play World in Flames for that. Because there's a certain, I'll use the term fidelity because I think realism and complexity can be odd terms because you can be complex without realism, and realism is such a moving target that it's almost not useful in any war game context. But the fidelity level, the types of things I need to think about and the types of decisions I need to make are deeper in many ways than I make in Axis Empires. And there are things that I have to think about that I don't have to think about in Axis Empires. That's not a good or a bad thing. It's a different thing in my mind. I am having to think differently for World in Flames. But that's Deluxe. Deluxe with options, and that is putting the flexibility of World in Flames is that you can play it simpler, you can play it more complex, and we play it, I see it as kind of the most complex way that you can play it. But we want that. And the reality is not everyone does. In fact, I think that people who really want to play Deluxe WiF play it because you can't really get that much fidelity from most other games in the same class. You just can't. I don't think A World at War tries to do all the things that World in Flames does. And so I really see Deluxe World in Flames as its own thing. It is trying to do something that Axis Empires doesn't try to do, that I would even say A World at War doesn't try to do. So making a comparison of Deluxe World in Flames to Axis Empires is not appropriate. I do not feel it is an appropriate comparison. I can try to compare it to what's referred to as Classic World in Flames, along with A World at War, because I think those are much closer in terms of what are you trying to do and what are you actually playing, that you can compare them more concretely. So as somebody who really likes Deluxe World in Flames, with all the fixins and all the optional rules, it's a wholly different thing. I think I'm getting something different out of that I'm getting out of Axis Empires. But Classic WiF, which has fewer counters, which has less rules, fits into a closer comparison. So I'm going to do that. That's a pretty important disclaimer and preamble I need to put out there when I talk about this. Another way I think I can relate this is I have a good friend of mine that plays World War II games like this. He likes A World at War as his top game. He considers Axis Empires as his second favorite, and he puts World in Flames third. If you were to ask me, I would have kind of an inverse of that. World in Flames is my favorite. I like Axis Empires quite a bit, so that earns number 2. And I am always frustrated by A World at War, which makes it number 3 for me. Now, if you look at that, two different takes on the situation, differing tastes, I prefer WiF, My friend prefers A World at War. But we both think Axis Empires is second favorite, or second best, or however you want to look at that. And I think that says something, right? The plurality of opinion is Axis Empires is a really good game. It might not be my favorite. It might not be quite as good as the one that my heart is set on. But I think there's something important to note about Axis Empires, and that it can have that broader appeal. I think it has to do with a couple of things. If I look at A World at War, I think A World at War is okay. I think it is way too complicated of a system to try to learn, which is weird. I don't think A World at War is very complicated. In fact, it should be less complicated than Deluxe World in Flames. I've owned A World at War longer than I've owned World in Flames, but I was able to learn World in Flames much easier than A World at War, which kind of makes me, you know, that contributes to me being a World in Flames fan. But A World at War is handling the gameplay at a similar level to Axis Empires. It too goes into more details on the naval aspects. I think Axis Empires with Schiffskrieg is about the same fidelity level, or pretty close, as A World at War. But A World at War has a problem. A World at War has a really hard rule book to parse, to read, to actually see the game all kind of work together and work the way it's supposed to work, and all the extra paperwork and notepads and pen and paper things you need to be filling out all the time. By comparison, Axis Empires is a smooth experience. And it's not even close. Like, it's above and beyond A World at War in that regard to a crazy degree. The rulebook for Axis Empires is easy peasy to navigate, easy peasy to learn. The training scenarios make actually just like, oh, how do I learn to play Axis Empires? Boom, it's right there for you. And you can learn it at your own pace if you need to, but it's a straightforward progression to learning all the systems, and they're fun games along the way. Like, the training scenarios are fun to navigate, and it works pretty darn well. Now, World at War has smaller scenarios that, in theory, you should be starting with and learning to play there, but it just doesn't hit the same way. And I don't know what it is. Maybe it's a format thing. Maybe it's the way that the rules are articulated. But you could start with what's the North Africa scenario for World at War to try to learn some of these things. But before long, you start running into all the weirdness and special exceptions that exist in a World at War context, where you don't really have that as much in Axis Empires. And Axis Empires manages to follow the thing that I like about World in Flames, that you're generally applying the same sorts of rules for every faction and every situation, with few special exceptions. So Axis Empires has that benefit, and actually getting it to the table and playing it leaps and bounds better than A World at War. So if the decision is between Axis Empires and A World at War, I mean, hands down, Axis Empires is the way to go, in my opinion. With or without Schiffskrieg, you're going to get to playing it, you're going to get to learning it, and you're going to get about the same out of the game, I think, generally speaking. Now, there are things that Axis Empires does not do the same as A World at War. A World at War has this kind of overwrought technology rule set. I know people really like it. To me, it's just more fiddling than is worth it for what you really get out of it. I'm just not enthused by it in any particular way. Axis Empires doesn't do that. That might be something really important to you, but what it does do is it represents advancements in technology and capability in the cards, in the progression of the game, and it works. So I think the ability to just get up and running and play the game and see things evolve and just playing through it so very quickly, it beats out A World at War for that reason. Now, if I compare Axis Empires to classic World in Flames, this is tough for me to say, guys, but I think I would more easily recommend Axis Empires to somebody than classic WiF. Okay? And that comes down to a couple of things. World in Flames, I think at any level, even in classic, does require some extra effort. There's the force pulls that take some doing to set up correctly and to have organized on a table or in Dixie cups or in however you're doing it. There's a certain level of overhead that is required for World in Flames. So much so that it makes it really hard to pick and choose even smaller or shorter scenarios to play in World in Flames. Even when you do that, you still have to fiddle around with the force pools, deal with scrapping, doing all these little things, and even then, you still have the, at its easiest, what can feel like a bit of a laborious production model. Now, again, when I play Deluxe WiF, that production model is part of the fidelity and complexity that I want out of Deluxe World in Flames. But if you're playing Classic World in Flames and you're just looking for a lighter game, you are taking on still these more complex aspects of World in Flames that may not be to everybody's cup of tea, and Axis Empires treats all of that much more simply and much more straightforward in many ways. And I think, again, if you're just looking for, hey, I want a World War II strategic game that's not going to be too tedious, that I can get right to playing, still feel like I'm fighting a good World War II simulation, to the point that you can, and have a lot of interesting options along the way, I think I can more easily recommend that. Now, if you're sitting there and going, yeah, but I really want all that fidelity and all that complexity of Deluxe WiF, then I would tell you, you're not going to find that here the same way. And yeah, you probably should get Deluxe WiF and join us in the highly exhausting Deluxe WiF landscape. But that's not for everybody. And I can't even pretend like it is for everybody. And if I look at that and I say, well, Classic WiF, if you're going to lose all this other fidelity, and you're still left with some of these more complex processes and tracing resources to factories and the craziness that can sometimes occur for the British Commonwealth and their convoy system, maybe you're better off playing something a bit simpler, or something that cuts some of the tedium out, or what could be considered tedium. And Axis Empires does that, and it does it much better than a World at War by comparison. So if the choice is between, again, Classic World in Flames, Axis Empires, and a World at War, I think Axis Empires is actually the winner in that contest. It takes the top spot, followed by Classic WiF, followed by a World at War, if you want to compare the big name World War II strategic games. And then, again, Deluxe WiF, I think that's its own thing. I think you have to want all of what Deluxe WiF offers you if you're going to do it. I think that's the best way to play it. I think that's the reason that you play WiF, is that you play it in the deluxe format with all the fixings, all the things that make it very immersive World War II experience. But to know that it's not for everybody, and I can't just generally recommend Deluxe World in Flames. I think you have to make a decision and have to want to do that and want to play it that way, and have a good group to play it with. I think Deluxe WiF is hard to play solitaire. I think you can get away with playing Classic WiF solitaire, but if you're going to be doing that, again, I think Axis Empires is going to serve your needs a bit better in that regard. So, maybe controversial to hear from a WiF guy, but I do think Axis Empires hits a very important level of complexity for what you get, and the type of experiences you can have with this game beats out some of its competitors for that lighter rendition of a World War II strategic game. And for me, it works out, because I don't have the time or the energy or wherewithal to play Deluxe WiF all the time. I play it when I can play it. I enjoy it when I do. I like my group. I like playing it when I'm able to. But if I wanted to play through a World War II strategic game more quickly at home solitaire, just to have an experience, this makes so much more sense to get to the table, to bust out, to set up and get playing, that it makes it a really good choice. So reflecting back on what I had just mentioned in the general part of the review, I think Axis Empires Ultimate Edition is a triumph of a package. I think it's done some really good things. Is it a perfect game? Well, no perfect game exists. And whatever issues I might have, or quibbles, or nitpicks, fade in the brightness that is the rest of the package. That what it does very reasonably well. It's a fun game experience. I think it's much more likely to see table play from people who have never played a World War II strategic game before. I think that's a really good thing. That's a very important thing, that you can pull somebody in and just play a Totalerkrieg campaign, right? I think even that is just fun. I might do that off camera over the next couple of months, guys, just because I want to. Like, I'm just going to play a 1939 Europe campaign, because I can, because it's easy to set up. I could do it pretty quickly and have a good time. Maybe play it without Schiffskrieg, and I could knock that game out in a record time and be happy with it and not take up all of my table space that has been taken up for months. So anyway, if there's no other way to end this video, it is in praise of Axis Empires Ultimate Edition. Very thankful that Decision Games delivered on this, that Thomas Prowl delivered on this, and his support on Board Game Geek for the game. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it was informative. It's probably a pretty long one. Sorry about that, guys, but this was a big game. This was a big review, one that I've been waiting some time to be able to give to you today. So thanks for watching, if you watched the whole thing, and we'll see you next time, guys. Take care. Keep gaming.